touch me again, and I'll kill you." The mafia boss didn't respond with fists. He responded with a gift. Dominic Romano, the notorious New York mafia kingpin, placed his mother's silver watch in my palm. That watch bore the symbol of the small town I grew up in, a symbol only my family would recognize. No one else could have known. He looked at me calm as a judge, neither angry nor amused. "You've got guts. I like that. But guts don't keep you alive." I gripped the watch tighter, feeling the line between protection and trap blur. I am Madison Cole, the veterinarian, who threatened a mafia boss, now holding proof that my fate was never an accident. It had been about 3 months since I found out what Ethan was really doing, and the memory still made my stomach turn over, kinda like that feeling you get when you realize you've driven past your exit on the highway and you can't get back. I'd trusted him not just with my heart, which was dumb enough, but with my sister's legacy, the small inheritance she left for Lily, my niece, right before she died. My sister, bless her heart, had worked 2 jobs, one at a diner and another cleaning offices late at night, stacking those funds slowly, carefully, with the explicit instruction that the money was for Lily's college fund, a promise of a future my sister never got to see a chance to escape the scraping-by life we had always known. Ethan, my supposedly devoted boyfriend, the one who always talked about his big plans and near-miss deals, had taken that money, over $20,000, and used it to pay off some bookie or maybe something worse, something tied up with the kind of people who don't send polite letters when you miss a payment. The realization hit me like a physical blow one Tuesday morning when the bank called, not about a simple late fee, but about an alarming overdraft and a set of forged documents showing a massive unauthorized line of credit. He hadn't just drained my accounts, he'd used my name, my actual signature forged and messy on some shady papers, a line of credit for his latest disastrous investment, linking me directly and legally to his mess. The shame of being so blind, of having such poor judgment about the person sleeping next to me, was almost as bad as the crippling fear of the debt. The night I finally confronted him, I found him playing some mindless video game in the living room, surrounded by takeout containers, and he didn't even turn off the sound when I shoved the damning bank statement under his nose. He just stood there in our tiny, cluttered kitchen, under that buzzing fluorescent light that always flickered, and he smiled. Not a nice smile, but a cold, small one that told me everything I needed to know. He didn't care about me. He didn't care about Lily's future. And he definitely didn't care about the consequences of bankrupting the only person who had ever believed in him. That smile, that quiet, ugly cruelty, was the real heartbreak the moment I understood that some people just use goodness as a resource to be consumed and discarded. It was why I was so frayed, so perpetually exhausted, so distracted that I was rushing through the service corridors of a mansion I didn't belong in, just trying to patch up a prize poodle that had swallowed a diamond earring. The earring, a single ridiculously brilliant thing I later learned, was worth enough to pay off every single one of my remaining student loans, and then some, which only added a bitter, painful twist to the desperation I felt that night. The call had been an emergency. Naturally, the kind that demands instant service regardless of the hour, and I was just desperate enough for the cash Ethan had left me with crippling student loan payments. Again, payments I thought he was handling with Lily's inheritance that I took at no questions asked, even when they told me the address was the infamous Romano estate. I had the poodle tucked under my arm, wrapped tightly in a fluffy white towel, the size of a small blanket, and I was trying to find the back staircase to the kitchen, where they'd set up a makeshift examination area with surprisingly sterile equipment. I was focused entirely on keeping the poor dog still and making sure I didn't drip antiseptic on the priceless Persian rugs, whose vibrant colors felt mocking under my worn scrubs. The heat from the kitchen was still on the towel, warming the poodle, and I could feel the thrumming of my own anxiety, a deep, restless tension that made my hands shake slightly, betraying my exhaustion. That's how I missed the subtle, barely there security guy who was supposed to be guarding the main VIP door. He'd stepped away for a moment, likely bored, thinking no one would be audacious enough to approach the door while the boss was holding court inside. I remember pulling open a heavy mahogany door, thinking it led to a pantry or a linen closet, and suddenly the sound hit me, a thick, expensive wall of laughter and tinkling glass, the heavy scent of cigars and rare perfume, and I was standing there smack in the middle of a room that felt like it was made entirely of smoke and Italian silk. My worn scrubs and muddy boots suddenly screaming volumes about my true place in the world. I froze caught like a rabbit in the blinding headlights of extreme wealth, and then I was moving, trying to retreat, trying to disappear back into the shadows of the service corridor. But the poodle wriggled, startling me. I think the loud booming music finally hit its nerves, and I stumbled a little, losing my balance just as I stepped right into the path of Dominic Romano himself. He was mid-sentence, talking low, his voice a gravelly, confident rumble, to two men whose suits probably cost more than my entire veterinary practice's inventory combined. He didn't flinch, didn't even pause his conversation, maintaining his focus on his business. But as I moved to slide past him, I felt the immediate, powerful clamp of his hand around my arm, stopping me dead. His touch was cold and firm, like a piece of polished steel, instantly demanding absolute obedience. He didn't grab me hard, not exactly, but the movement was possessive absolute, just enough to prevent me from bumping his crystal glass, which was filled with a dark amber liquid that looked like liquid gold and cost more than my rent. It was the shock of that casual ownership, the assumption that he could just touch me, a woman already carrying the weight of the world, still bruised and reeling from Ethan's rough, handsy betrayal and theft that snapped the very last thread of my control. Everything I'd been holding in the crushing debt, the paralyzing fear for Lily's stability, the raw humiliation of being used and discarded like trash by the man I loved, all of it condensed into that one guttural response that just came flying out before my brain could stop it, a defense mechanism born of absolute desperation. I yanked my arm back like his skin was fire, leaving the ghostly imprint of his cold fingers on my skin. The poodle letting out a muffled yelp of protest, and I stared him right in those dark, unreadable eyes, forgetting everything but the blinding protective rage of the last few months. I didn't shout it. I said it low, dangerously quiet, the way I talk, when I'm truly terrified, the way you speak, when you know you have nothing left to lose and you are ready to fight to the death. Touch me again and I'll kill you. The silence that followed wasn't just a moment. It was a physical absence of sound that seemed to suck the air right out of the room, a kind of vacuum where the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint whimpering dog. The music, a smooth jazz ensemble tucked away in the corner, seemed to abruptly mute itself, and the dozens of conversations going on around us, the negotiations, the gossip, the casual chatter just evaporated. I saw half a dozen phones raise instantly expensive, shiny state-of-the-art devices, the small red lights of camera recording indicators blinking, which is why that ridiculous moment got caught from every angle, filmed for posterity and instant ridicule, and went instantly viral, or at least viral within that specific, exclusive, and terrifying circle. The two men he'd been speaking to looked like they'd just witnessed a magic trick that went fatally wrong, their jaws slack with disbelief, already mentally calculating the repercussions of my unbelievable audacity. Dominic, though, he just looked at me. His expression didn't change at all, not even a twitch of the mouth, no sign of offense or amusement. He didn't release the glass he was holding. He simply lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving mine, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod, the kind of acknowledging gesture a king might give to a doomed peasant, like I'd just confirmed a suspicion he'd had all along about the true nature of desperation when it finally breaks free. I turned, pushing past the velvet ropes, without looking back, feeling the sting of the heat on my neck clinging to the whimpering poodle, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs that was so loud I was sure the whole room could hear it. I knew with a certainty that iced my blood that I'd just signed my own death warrant, and maybe Lily's too, by putting a target on my back. The next day, those trashy underground tabloids had a field day dubbing me the vet who threatened the devil. It was a joke to them, the ultimate absurdity, a footnote in their endless gossip. But it didn't feel funny when the chilling message arrived on my burner phone, the cheap disposable one Ethan had insisted I get for privacy. Next time you talk back, the kid dies. They knew about Lily. That is the absolute terror I am talking about. The one where you realize you've been so focused on navigating the small, miserable betrayals of your own life the day-to-day struggle for survival, that you've walked straight into a world where everything is high stakes and permanent. They weren't just threatening my credit score or my meager savings anymore. They were threatening the 8-year-old girl who believed I could fix everything with a bandage and a kiss, the one person in my life who was purely innocent. This sudden, violent intrusion into my life felt like the ultimate punishment for simply trying to be resilient, for standing up for myself, after Ethan had so thoroughly flattened me and left me for ruin. The irony wasn't lost on me either the first time I showed real raw fight, that gut-deep survival instinct. It was aimed at the one man who actually had the power to protect me, and now that very fight had put the only person I loved in mortal danger, making me the cause of my own tragedy. That message, that single cold line referring to Lily, proved that my single sentence spoken in anger at the wrong time had dragged me into a place where every single threat, even the ones that sound like hyperbole, have a very real, very lethal price tag. The moment I read it, seeing Lily's name in those cold digital letters, I knew I had to go back. I had to face the man I had just threatened, because he was the only bridge to the monster threatening Lily, the only person with the power to reach them. And I had to find a way to make him see me as something other than a nuisance he needed to eliminate. I had to make him see me as a necessary evil and ally, or at least a resource worth protecting. Now, before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, things get so much wilder, can I just take a second here? Look, if you're watching this, it's probably because you get it. You've been underestimated, or you've been caught in a moment where you just couldn't hold back anymore, where the pressure just became too much. That connection means the world to me, and it's why I'm telling you all of this now, sharing this unbelievably raw part of my life. So just take a quick moment and open your phone, please. Give this video a like, leave a little comment below. Tell me you're with me. Tell me you understand that feeling, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking this path together. It really helps me out, and it makes sure you don't miss a single step of this crazy ride that redefined my entire life. Thank you. Okay, deep breath. Because the next thing that happened, the thing that saved me and trapped me all at once, was the biggest plot twist of my life. A move so calculated and strange that I'm still not sure if I was being spared or studied, if I was a prize or a puzzle he intended to solve. Instead of sending his men to drag me out of my apartment, instead of an anonymous bullet, Dominic Romano invited me back into his office the next morning. I walked in expecting the end, honestly thinking about what last thing I would say about Lily, who I should leave her with, feeling that hollow dread that tasted like old copper. The office was vast, modern, and intimidatingly quiet. All dark wood and glass overlooking the city, a space that commanded absolute subservience. He was standing by the window, not even looking at me when I entered, just staring out at the skyscrapers. He finally turned, and that's when he said the lines that were eerily familiar. The ones about guts not keeping me alive, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the watch. It wasn't a cheap thing. It was heavy old-fashioned sterling silver with a very specific engraving on the back that I recognized instantly. It was the crest of a little almost forgotten town in upstate New York, a place called Willow Creek, where my own family had originated before moving down to the city for work 3 generations ago. The crest was a simple thing, 2 intertwining willow branches over a stream, a symbol only my grandmother and I had ever talked about, a symbol that represented our deep, humble roots and the quiet dignity of hard labor. I'd only ever seen that symbol once before on an old locket my grandmother used to wear before she passed. His mother's watch. He was trying to tell me something without saying it, connecting himself to my past, to my low-status roots, and hinting that he knew exactly where I came from, and maybe even who I came from. It was a calculated move, one designed to disarm me by showing a knowledge that should have been impossible for a man of his stature to possess. It made me feel seen, terrifyingly so, as if he had run a detailed background check not just on my debt, but on my soul. He explained the connection to the watch, but not directly. He just said it was his mother's, and that it was a reminder of a life that wasn't built on this sort of wealth, a past that he had fought to escape, or maybe protect from the harsh glare of his current empire. He told me that his mother had held on to that watch all her life, a tiny piece of her modest history, and that she understood the price of being an outsider in a world obsessed with pedigree. I could see a flicker, just a brief shadow in his eyes, a kind of deep-seated sadness that had nothing to do with power or threats, but everything to do with loss and a hidden vulnerability that surprised me. In that split second, I wondered if maybe he was seeing his mother, a woman who probably didn't belong in this world either, who likely faced similar dismissiveness when he looked at me, seeing a quiet strength he recognized and maybe even respected, because he came from that same struggle. But that moment of possible connection, that brief lapse into humanity, was instantly crushed by his next command, a quick, sharp command that reminded me exactly who he was and why I was there. He told me I couldn't leave, not yet. He ordered me to stay at the mansion overnight in one of their ridiculous guest suites, a place designed to make you feel temporary and indebted, where the opulence felt like a smothering blanket. He said it was so he could decide whether to kill me or protect me, but the tone of his voice suggested the decision had already been made, and that this overnight stay was just a formality of his own calculation, a chance to study the dangerous creature he had captured and brought into his domain. He said, and this is the part that still gives me chills, that there were forces moving against him, that had seen my outburst as a signal, a weakness he needed to manage, and that if I left, I would be dead before I reached the bridge, targeted by the same people who sent the threat about Lily. I realized he wasn't just talking about Sergei Karamov and the larger threat of the Russian mafia. He was talking about Ethan and whoever Ethan had sold me out, to realizing that my life was now intricately tangled up in a dangerous web of his making, and I was now his responsibility, whether I liked it or not. I stayed. What choice did I have? Leaving meant certain death for me and a probable capture for Lily, who would then be used as leverage against Dominic. I was moved into a suite that was bigger than my entire apartment, with marble floors and a bathroom that felt like a spa, the towels perpetually warm, and the air thick with the scent of lilies. But it still felt like a cage, maybe even more so because of the extreme luxury, a constant sickening reminder of the wealth that separated me from him and from the simple, honest life I was fighting to get back to. I spent the night staring out the window at the endless sprawl of the city lights, terrified yet clinging to that heavy silver watch, turning it over and over in my palm, wondering what it meant that the most powerful, ruthless man in the city was holding proof of my humble beginnings and using it as a shield. By the morning, the story was already changing, twisting from a joke into a legend that was being carefully shaped by the boss. The quiet staff, the maids, the drivers, the cooks, they all knew. The mocking whispers from the party had completely shifted. Now when I walked into the dining area, the staff didn't look at me with curiosity or disdain. They looked at me with a strange mix of deference and fear, as if I carried a secret weapon they dared not approach. I overheard one of the housekeepers murmuring to a guard as I passed, her voice hushed, but distinct. The new title settling over me like a heavy velvet cloak. She's the woman under the boss's protection. The phrase felt heavy, like a new layer of skin, changing how I walked and how I held my head. It meant I was no longer the joke, but I also wasn't free. I was suddenly an asset, a pawn on Dominic Romano's board, and I knew that if he decided to protect me, it was entirely for his own benefit. He had broken his own rule by choosing to keep a perceived threat close, and I was determined to use the time this offered me to figure out his true motive and, more importantly, to find a way to save Lily permanently. The mansion quickly became my gilded prison, a cage made of gold, and the confinement was suffocating, much worse than being in a sparse jail cell would have been, because the luxury itself was a constant mocking reminder of my lost freedom and my low origins. Every morning I would wake up in that huge, silent room, the silk sheets tangled around me, and feel the weight of my lost freedom pressing down on me, the quiet hum of the security system reminding me I couldn't leave. I tried to focus on the gardens, the elaborate fountains, the endless art, the way the light hit the ancient sculptures. But it all felt hollow and empty without Lily. I couldn't see her. Dominic had moved her not back home where I knew she missed her old toys and the stray cat we fed, but to a safe house, a term that sounded terrifyingly official and impersonal, run by people I didn't know or trust. While he assured me she was well taken care of, daily reports, pictures of her reading a note about her favorite flavor of ice cream. The separation was a constant, sharp pain, a kind of phantom limb ache that never went away. That pain was exactly what the outside world focused on too, knowing it was the quickest way to chip away at my resolve. The underworld, always hungry for drama and weaknesses, mocked my new status, instantly interpreting the sudden protection as a crude reward for something illicit. The phrase, "He's just keeping her around for fun like a prize-fighting bird he found in the gutter," became the new gossip, echoing the kind of cheap, misogynistic assumptions that low-status women are always saddled with when they get close to power. Then that dark blog, the one that tracked all the mafia movements and scandals, published a blurry, zoomed-in photo of me walking the manicured grounds in a borrowed tracksuit, labeling it with cruel alliteration, "From vet to Valentino's pet." It felt like being stripped naked and exposed in front of a cruel, judging audience that assumed my only value was decorative or worse, purely transactional, and that I was nothing more than a pretty piece of property. The isolation was almost unbearable. A silence so deep it felt like noise, but the worst was when Ethan showed up one afternoon, requesting to see me, claiming he was worried about my disappearance and the rumors. The guards, of course, let him through. He was a nobody in their world, smelling of cheap cologne and desperation, but he seemed harmless enough to them, just a former flame checking on a friend. He sat across from me in one of the parlor rooms, a place filled with fragile antiques, nursing a glass of sparkling water, his eyes running over the expensive furniture with a frantic, envious hunger. I recognized instantly from our time together a hunger for what he felt he deserved, but couldn't earn. He wasn't worried. He was gloating, trying to reclaim some of the power he had lost when he realized he couldn't find me or manipulate me anymore. He sneered the same ugly small smile from the kitchen and delivered his punchline, making sure the words hit their target and cut deep into my self-worth. "He'll get bored. They all do, Madison. Look at you, you're not even wearing makeup. You're still dressed in those awful sweats. You always make men bored because you're so utterly ordinary. That's why you're here, a pretty distraction until he finds something new to break. You think that silver watch makes you special? It just makes you the flavor of the month, a little joke he'll tell his friends." His words were designed to pierce the last bit of my dignity, to remind me that my financial weakness, my humble job and my quiet demeanor, meant that I was inherently disposable in their world, a temporary plaything waiting to be discarded. I didn't raise my voice or plead with him. I just focused on the way he gripped the crystal glass, the insecurity trembling visibly in his hand, and I realized he wasn't here to hurt me. He was here because he desperately needed to believe that I was still the small, weak thing he could manipulate and shame, and that his failure wasn't his own fault. It was that moment, with Ethan, watching him try to reassert his control through petty insults and projection, that something fundamental shifted inside me. I was stripped of my physical freedom, my public dignity, and the comforting presence of my niece, but I wasn't stripped of my intellect. The key to escape, I realized with chilling clarity, wasn't emotional pleading or a desperate theatrical run for the fence. It was pure cold strategy executed with the same quiet precision I used in surgery. I decided right then to stop being Valentino's pet and start becoming the smartest prisoner in the mansion, using their own low expectations against them as camouflage. I began subtly changing my behavior, playing the part they expected, the fragile, emotionally overwhelmed woman, occasionally shedding a well-timed quiet tear into a napkin, talking about how overwhelmed I was by the sheer size of the estate, and how confusing all of Dominic's business was, pretending to be utterly lost. I knew the guards saw me as simple, just the vet, incapable of understanding anything beyond pet health, and I leaned into that low expectation entirely. I started chatting up one of the younger, more talkative guards, not about Romano, but about the beautiful architecture and the headaches of managing such a massive operation, asking detailed questions about the rotation schedules and the security blind spots, all under the guise of being afraid of the darkness and the empty corridors at night. I'd ask simple, unassuming questions phrased as nervous worries like, "Dominic must be so stressed with that big deal he's trying to close, right? It seems like you guys are running all over the place, covering too much ground. Is everything going to be okay? It looks so complicated." I kept playing the innocent, letting him think he was comforting me, and that he was so much more important than I was, sharing his superior knowledge with the boss's naive girlfriend who was clearly out of her depth. Over the course of a week, through these seemingly random, fearful questions, I pieced together the fragments of the ongoing deal with Sergei Karamov, the who, the when, and the crucial, fatal flaw in Romano's current structure. The guard, proud to be sharing insider information with the boss's pretty new distraction, inadvertently revealed enough detail for me to understand that Karamov was not only planning to screw Romano over, but that the deal was entirely dependent on a complex legal loophole tied to a temporary tax-free zone established on the East River ports, set to expire in 3 months. This loophole would, upon closing the deal, essentially give Karamov control of Romano's major shipping ports and transportation logistics within 3 months, crippling his operations financially and territorially, leaving Dominic exposed to government intervention. It was a betrayal in plain sight, hidden under layers of legitimate-sounding contracts and shell companies. I knew I had to act fast, and I did it with something I'd managed to sneak past the initial search, a small prepaid flip phone the size of a key fob, hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of a thick, forgotten medical textbook I'd insisted on keeping for late-night reading. Using that phone, I typed out an anonymous, meticulously detailed summary of the Karamov deal, focusing solely on the legal and financial liabilities related to the tax zone expiration and the suspicious timing of the contract closure. I didn't use any underworld jargon or threats. I framed it as a serious breach of fiduciary duty and corporate malfeasance, exposing the legal vulnerability that would trigger major government scrutiny of the legitimate foundation. I included zero mention of the Mafia or Romano, framing it entirely as a massive impending corporate fraud case about to break one of the city's largest foundations, the very foundation Dominic was using as a front. I sent the information to a respected independent lawyer, known for exposing corporate malfeasance, someone known to be incorruptible and meticulous in his research, ensuring the leak would be taken seriously and handled through legitimate channels that couldn't be traced back to the mansion. The results were instantaneous and devastating for Karamov. Because the information was framed legally, it hit the right corporate pressure points, securing a court-ordered freeze on assets, triggering internal audits by the city and causing a sudden massive collapse in Karamov's allied financial deals. He lost face spectacularly within the legal and financial worlds. His allies, seeing him as suddenly incompetent and vulnerable to legal exposure, abandoned him in droves, worried about the spillover effect the scrutiny would bring to their own operations. The Russian Empire was temporarily crippled, its forward momentum completely stalled, and Dominic Romano was without lifting a finger, saved from a ruinous financial and territorial loss that would have destabilized his entire operation and risked his freedom. The day after the news broke, splashed across the front page of the financial section, under a massive headline, Dominic called me back into his office. He didn't ask how I knew. He didn't ask what I did. He just held up the newspaper, pointing to the column describing Karamov's sudden, spectacular downfall, his fingers tracing the headline with a quiet intensity. His lips barely moved when he spoke, but the respect in his voice was palpable, a new heavy currency in the room that changed the dynamic, instantly moving us from captive and captor to something closer to reluctant partners. He looked at me, not at the paper, and said with a quiet intensity that went straight to my core, "You've got more power in your silence than most men in my circle, Madison. You saw the game and exposed the rules they tried to hide. You took out a threat I didn't even know existed inside the perimeter. In that moment, I wasn't his pet, his distraction, or his joke. I was the person who had turned captivity into pure cold strategy, proving that my quiet resilience and intellectual depth were far more dangerous than any shout or any desperate emotional outburst he was used to handling. But in this world, saving the devil just meant the other devils came for you with more vengeance, sensing the new fragile dynamic between the boss and his unlikely savior. The truth about me helping him, that I was intelligent, that I was an asset, didn't stay quiet for long. It morphed instantly into a new, more dangerous rumor Dominic Romano was falling for the vet, and that made him weak, ruled by sentimentality. They couldn't abide by the idea that power could be moved by something like intelligence or quiet loyalty, so they reduced it to the oldest, most consumable motive, love and lust. This rumor was the perfect weapon against him, a way to shame him back into the expected ruthless archetype and make his allies question his judgment. A week later, at a massive televised gala, the kind where the champagne flowed like water and the jewelry alone could bail out a small country, I was standing next to Dominic, feeling terribly awkward in a borrowed dress that felt like a costume, my hands clasped nervously behind my back, wishing I were back in my scrubs. That dress-white satin was stunning, but felt completely alien on my body, like I was wearing a glass slipper I would shatter. That's when I faced the next wave of targeted humiliation. A woman sharp-eyed and dripping in diamonds, whose name I later learned was Sylvia, a rival's wife. I found out who saw me as an easy target, smiled sweetly a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and deliberately, with a subtle yet visible move of her elbow that was choreographed to look like an accident, spilled an entire glass of deep red Cabernet right down the front of my pristine white satin dress. The stain bloomed instantly, mortifyingly, spreading like a venomous flower across the delicate fabric, ruining the dress, and instantly drawing every eye in the massive ballroom to my catastrophic blunder. Before I could even process the shock or the sting of the sudden cold liquid, the woman delivered her cruel line loud enough for a dozen people to overhear, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oops. My apologies, darling. This isn't exactly a place for charity cases, is it? Maybe stick to the service entrance next time you're cleaning up." The laughter that followed was light, brittle, and devastating, a chorus of high society dismissal. I could feel the heat rising on my cheeks, and the weight of hundreds of eyes on me, all waiting to see my reaction, waiting for me to crumble, to cry, or to flee in shame, confirming their assumptions. Instead, I simply took a slow, steady breath, forcing the air down into my lungs, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. I looked the woman in the eye, not with anger, but with a steady, deep assessment that seemed to surprise her, making her smile falter and her eyes widen, and I quietly pulled a crisp linen napkin from a passing waiter's tray and dabbed gently, futilely at the stain, a small, defiant gesture of control in a moment designed to make me feel utterly powerless. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, refusing to retreat, refusing to acknowledge the shame, and that quiet, stubborn refusal to play the victim seemed to confuse the crowd even more than the wine spill. But the humiliation wasn't just physical. It was systemic, designed to expose my poverty. At that very moment, across the city, Ethan had leaked all my old financial records, my crippling student debts, the bankruptcy my family faced after the housing crash, all the ugly, embarrassing details that painted me as the ultimate scraping-by, low-status nobody who had no business in that room, confirming Sylvia's vicious barb. The leak went wide, confirming the charity case insult for the entire city. But the most painful blow, the one that truly shattered me, came straight to Lily. I found out later that day, through a frantic, choked-up call from the safe house minder, that the kids at her school, kids whose parents were probably at that very gala, had started bullying her, mercilessly armed with the new gossip and the knowledge of my connection to Dominic. They were chanting the new nickname delivered with the casual, innocent cruelty only kids can muster. "Your aunt sleeps with the mafia boss. Your aunt is the devil's pet." That was the point where the emotional damage became a very real, tangible threat to the one person I needed to shield, realizing that my attempts to protect her were only making her a bigger target for the venom of the underworld. The final layer of humiliation was the live stream, the silent, agonizing social media feed from the gala, where the party crowd was openly waiting to see what Dominic would do. Would he defend me, his rumored lover, and admit to a weakness? Or would he let me fall, confirming that I was indeed disposable? I stood there, stain and all, feeling completely alone, watching Dominic across the room talking to a diplomat, his face a perfectly blank canvas, a man who gave nothing away. I understood that I was at the mercy of his choice, and my reputation, my dignity, and Lily's peace were all on the line, hanging precariously in the balance. The crowd watched, anticipating my fall, ready for the entertainment to end with the whimper of the dismissed vet. But Dominic didn't let me fall. He didn't rush over or shout at Sylvia, the woman who spilled the wine, or even glance in her direction, treating the entire exchange as insignificant noise in his world. His move was much more strategic, absolute, and publicly defining. He walked toward me slowly, deliberately giving every camera and every watchful eye time to lock on his presence, a heavy, undeniable gravity in the room that pulled all attention away from the wine stain. He didn't acknowledge the stain or the woman who caused it, treating the entire exchange as insignificant noise. Instead, he simply took my hand, his grip warm and steady, and he led me not off the stage of public ridicule, not to the back exit to change, but onto the actual stage where the charity auction was taking place, a platform lit by spotlights. The noise level of the room dropped again, that familiar, terrifying silence returning. But this time, it was laced with genuine curiosity, not mocking judgment. He took the microphone from the stunned auctioneer, who looked like a deer caught in the headlights. And with the most powerful people in the city, and the entire underworld watching, he publicly appointed me as the director of the Romano Foundation, the Empire's highly visible legal humanitarian arm. This was not a token gesture or a simple title change. It was an instant transfer of immense legitimate power control over a billion-dollar portfolio and a new public identity that redefined my existence. He then delivered the declaration that changed the narrative entirely, drawing a line between the petty slights and a deeper, darker history that no one else understood. He looked out at the silent, watching crowd and said, his voice carrying the weight of unquestionable command, "She is not a guest. She is not a curiosity. She is the woman who once saved a witness who was supposed to die for my sins. She operates with my complete authority, and she answers only to me." That line was brilliant, calculated to appeal to the brutal transactional logic of the underworld. It wasn't about love or charity. It was about the ancient code of debts and life-saving actions, linking my quiet presence to a debt he owed, making me an extension of his power, and therefore untouchable. He reframed my worth in terms of undeniable utility and power, not affection forcing them to respect my title, not my background. With that instant power, the new title and the financial and legal resources it commanded, I had access. Access to the Foundation's secure databases, access to its top legal teams, and the authority to demand internal audits of all related subsidiaries and contacts. It took me less than 48 hours using the Foundation's resources to uncover the full extent of Ethan's betrayal. He wasn't just settling old gambling debts. He was actively selling minute-by-minute proprietary financial data about the Foundation and Dominic's legal operations directly to Sergei Karamov, confirming he was a well-placed, greedy pawn in the larger Russian scheme to destabilize the empire from the inside. Ethan was captured, quickly pulled from his pathetic, tiny apartment in the middle of the night, dragged from the cheap comfort he had bought with Lily's money. I didn't have to give the order. The moment I presented the evidence, the system corrected itself, dispensing its own brutal justice. I watched a clip from the security room as Dominic's men escorted him away. His face pale, the sneer finally gone, replaced by pure abject terror, his small body collapsing with the weight of consequence. Dominic looked at Ethan in the video, and then back at me, a flash of something unreadable in his eyes. Maybe gratitude mixed with regret for the blindness of others. He didn't try to execute Ethan, but he handed him over to his own private justice system, a labyrinth of debt and permanent servitude that I knew was far worse than jail, where he would spend the rest of his miserable life paying back what he had stolen. His words delivered to Ethan and recorded on the security feed for posterity were ice. "You taught me loyalty through betrayal. Madison taught me loyalty through silence. I didn't linger on the moment of his downfall. I didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, cold closure. I walked away from the scene with a cold certainty. And as the stories spread, the mocking stopped instantly. The whispers now were different, laced with respect and fear. The vet queen, I had risen from public disgrace to a symbol of power, not because of Dominic's feelings, but because of my own sharp, quiet, strategic mind that turned their expectations against them. This sudden public elevation, however, only infuriated Sergei Karamov further, because I was now directly interfering with his ability to strike at Dominic, stabilizing the very empire he sought to shatter. The Russian knew he couldn't touch me directly, without risking a full-scale war with a newly solidified power structure, so he went for the narrative, seeking to break the trust between Dominic and his own inner circle, casting doubt on the boss's judgment. Sergei released a fake, heavily manipulated video that was professionally produced to look like candid footage taken inside the mansion. It spliced together old clips of Dominic being angry about business matters and edited in my face, creating the illusion of a furious, drunken argument, branding me the manipulator behind the boss. The emotional flaw, the woman who had somehow made the devil weak by distracting him with sentimentality. The rumor was devastatingly effective because it preyed on the existing fears of the traditionalists. Dominic's inner circle men who valued tradition, cold logic, and ruthless self-preservation over everything else began to demand my removal, citing me as a liability, an emotional destabilizer that was disrupting the organization's efficiency and risking their livelihoods. The pressure was immense, focused entirely on the fact that I was an outsider, a commoner, a vet who had suddenly been given too much authority. I was brought into a meeting with the 5 most powerful Capo's men with hard, skeptical eyes and suits tailored to hide the weapons underneath men who were determined to see me gone. The room was heavy with the smell of expensive leather and deep unspoken threats that hung in the air like smoke. They spoke in coded polite language, talking about prudence and maintaining balance and the need for family unity, but the message was clear and chilling. My presence was dividing the family, a sign of Dominic's poor judgment, and I needed to step down or worse, face their own brand of private consequences. The tension was suffocating, and I knew this was my breaking point, the moment where all the strategy and intelligence in the world couldn't save me from raw tradition. I sat there quietly listening to their thinly veiled insults about my lack of pedigree and emotional volatility, holding the silver watch inside my pocket for comfort, its coolness a tether to reality. Then the real threat arrived, not through them, but through a cold, anonymous, encrypted message delivered to Dominic's personal computer. During the meeting, a message only he could see. It detailed the specific location of Lily's safe house down to the exact apartment number and the color of the curtains, complete with times and daily routines, followed by a chilling final instruction: leave Dominic and the Empire immediately, disappearing forever, or Lily gets taken. I watched Dominic read it, saw the subtle hardening around his jaw, the almost imperceptible clench of his fist under the table, and I felt the blood drain from my face, knowing he had to choose. I was forced to choose not between my life and my job, but between Lily's location and my entire future, between my dignity and her survival. The worst part was Dominic's silence. He sat at the head of the table throughout the meeting, listening to the arguments for my removal, listening to the very men who had just seen the threat to my niece. And he didn't say a single word. He didn't look at me. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't even acknowledge the threat he had just read, keeping his face a blank mask. I watched him, searching for a sign, a flicker of understanding, a nod of shared resolve. And when I found nothing but a blank, unreadable mask, the last fragile piece of my trust shattered into a million pieces. I believed he had turned against me, choosing his empire and his stability over me and my niece, or at least choosing neutrality in the face of an impossible choice that would risk his authority with his inner circle. His silence felt like a dismissal, a final abandonment worse than anything Ethan had ever done, because it was delivered with such cold, powerful detachment. I decided right then to run. I didn't see the running as a betrayal, but as a sacrifice of my newfound power for the life of my niece. If I left, if I disappeared completely, maybe I could draw the heat away from Lily and disappear into the anonymity of the world, giving her a chance at freedom and a future away from the shadow of the Mafia. I planned my escape meticulously over the next hour, pretending to be calmly organizing my notes from the meeting. I knew that the guards would be watching, but I assumed that Dominic's crushing silence was my consent to leave a nonverbal dismissal. I slipped out through the massive grounds at midnight, wearing dark clothing and moving like a shadow, using my knowledge of the service tunnels and the garden layout, all the things I had learned while pretending to be the naive pet, to make my way to the perimeter fence. The dread was a heavy, cold presence in my chest, a certainty that I was abandoning the only real protection I had ever known, trading immense power for terrifying uncertainty. I was so focused on the fear of what Sergei would do to Lily, and the deep, raw pain of Dominic's perceived abandonment, that I was unaware that the entire escape was nothing more than a carefully laid trap, orchestrated by Sergei himself, designed to expose Dominic's true commitment to me. The path I thought was freedom was actually a direct line into the Russian's waiting hands, and I only realized it when a car, sleek and black, materialized out of the shadows, blocking my way, and two massive men emerged from the shadows, with guns drawn, their faces grim and familiar. The trap sprung violently at the global mafia summit in Rome, the culmination of all the rivalry and posturing in the underworld. I was captured and taken there, bundled onto the main floor in front of hundreds of powerful men from every syndicate and criminal organization in the world, the air thick with tension and the smell of expensive leather and cold anticipation. Sergei Karamov, radiating cold arrogance and absolute control, intended to publicly humiliate me one last time, not just to break me, but to break Dominic's carefully constructed image of power by parading his supposed weakness on a global stage. He stood next to me, gripping my arm tightly, sneering, detailing my student debts and my humble background, the cheap price he claimed I was worth, all while the cameras rolled from international news agencies disguised as trade press. He wanted to show the world that Dominic Romano was compromised by a woman who could be bought with a few $1,000s, a common pet, who had no loyalty. But just as Sergei raised his hand, gesturing for the final devastating insult, the presentation of the forged betrayal video to begin, Dominic entered the room. It wasn't an entrance. It was a force field, an overwhelming shift in energy that stopped the flow of conversation dead. The chatter and the noise of the entire gathering shifted instantly, the room dying down to a low, nervous hum like a disturbed hive. He walked straight through the crowd, not running, not even looking angry, but moving with a slow, focused intention that commanded pure instinctual fear, his eyes locked solely on me, ignoring every other figure in the room. He didn't speak to Sergei. He didn't even spare the Russian a glance. He simply walked up to the stage, ignoring the surprised guards, and pulled me in front of him, closer than he ever had in public, his hand resting securely on the small of my back, a gesture of absolute possession. He placed his hands firmly on my shoulders, his grip warm and steady, a silent reassurance, his gaze sweeping over the audience, holding every single eye contact, challenging anyone to look away. He waited for the silence to become absolute, for the cameras to whir, and then he spoke, his voice measured, deep and deadly calm, shattering Sergei's entire plan in a single defining sentence. "She's not my weakness. She's my right hand, and the only one who never lied to me, not when I was vulnerable and not when I was strong." Then, in an unprecedented move defying the advice of every lawyer and advisor in the room, he announced a massive immediate transfer of a significant portion of the Romano Empire's legal assets, the Foundation's entirety, the vital shipping contracts, and several key development properties directly into my name, making me the undisputed legal majority shareholder of the whole legitimate arm of the Romano enterprise. This was not a gift of love. It was a public coronation of sovereign power, an act that made me a necessary, untouchable partner in the eyes of the entire world and a person who now held a direct legal key to his financial survival. By making my power public and legal, he destroyed every scheme built to divide us, and I was no longer the scorned woman, but the untouchable queen, a ruler in my own right. And then, standing before the entire global underworld, with every camera flashing and every rival seething, he bent his head and kissed me. It was a firm, definitive kiss, a gesture of absolute ownership, and a declaration of absolute mutual respect and shared fate, a signal to the world that if they came for him, they were coming for the sovereign power I held in my hands. Sergei, his public humiliation complete, was enraged and utterly desperate, cornered like a wounded animal. He immediately went for the one thing he knew still tethered me to my emotional vulnerability, Lily. In a move of ultimate psychological cruelty, he managed to kidnap her from the safe house, streaming the event live across the underworld's encrypted channels for maximum impact. The video was a cold, calculated horror that ripped through my resolve. Lily, small and tearful, tied to a chair in a sparse concrete room, looking straight at the camera and asking for her Aunt Madison. Sergei's voice, a chilling monotone, delivered his final threat. "Touch her again, and she dies. You lose the boss, or you lose the girl." He had successfully branded me the curse that doomed the boss, arguing that my presence was so toxic it had endangered the next generation of the Romano Empire, creating a catastrophic internal instability. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Romano's men divided sharply, some terrified of the instability, and the threat to the family's future wanted to negotiate for Lily. and demanded my immediate sacrifice to restore order, while others, the loyal few who understood the depth of Dominic's commitment, were ready to fight a civil war brewing in the shadows of the organization. The pressure mounted in that desperate dark bunker where Sergei had taken us. He forced me to record a final video, one designed to look like a desperate, tearful confession, betraying Dominic and claiming he had abandoned me for his empire. He handed me a phone. The camera lens pointed mercilessly at my face and whispered the lines he wanted me to deliver, words that would destroy Dominic's authority and turn his own men against him forever. I looked straight into the camera lens, seeing Lily's tear-streaked face in my mind, remembering the pain of Ethan's sneer and the deep, silent wound of Dominic's silence at the capo meeting. I reached into my pocket, feeling the steady weight of the silver watch on my wrist, the symbol of my true strength. I knew then that Dominic hadn't been silent at the capo meeting because he was betraying me. He was silent because he was waiting for the perfect public moment to act, protecting me from a premature attack that would have ended in my death. I had to pay him back with the same trust, the same calculated risk. I refused to deliver Sergei's scripted words. Instead, I stared into the camera, my voice low and steady, resurrecting the very sentence that had dragged me into this world, the one the tabloids had mocked, but turning it into a protective spell over Dominic, using my own curse to threaten his rival instead. I didn't even blink, refusing to show fear. If he comes for me, I'll kill him myself. It was a direct final challenge to Sergei, the absolute refusal of victimhood, and a message of fierce, unshakable loyalty to the only man who had ever trusted my intelligence. The moment the video ended, everything exploded into motion, the calculated stillness giving way to raw, brutal violence. Dominic, who had been pretending to accept Sergei's ransom deal over a series of phone calls, had successfully planted a tiny, sophisticated tracker in the Russian's last phone call, a move that only the best tech in the underworld could pull off. The chaos I had created by publicly challenging Sergei gave Dominic the cover he needed to track the signal without alerting the entire compound. I was still captive, and knowing the compound was heavily guarded, maybe a dozen men, all of them armed, I used the one thing I had: my veterinary skills and my knowledge of common chemicals. I faked a nervous breakdown, begging a young, anxious guard for water, claiming I was going to pass out from stress. As he bent down, concerned about my sudden collapse, I used my sleeve to inject him quickly and clinically, with a concentrated reactive sedative I'd managed to synthesize from common household chemicals found in the makeshift kitchen, something I had intended to use on myself as a last resort, a way to numb the pain of capture. The guard collapsed instantly in a non-lethal seizure-like fit, thrashing violently on the concrete floor, and the resulting alarm and panic created the perfect diversion, scattering the attention of the remaining men, drawing them away from Lily's room. Dominic stormed the compound alone, not waiting for backup, refusing to risk a broader conflict that would endanger Lily. He fought his way through the ensuing confusion with a terrifying ferocity I had never witnessed. The noise was deafening: shouts, gunshots, the sound of glass breaking, and bodies hitting the ground. I saw him coming, bursting through the flimsy door covered in blood that wasn't all his own. His suit torn, his face set in a grim mask of absolute determination. He was bleeding heavily from a deep cut on his arm, a serious wound, but he didn't slow down, taking out the remaining guards with a cold, brutal efficiency I had only heard whispers about. He reached the room, his eyes instantly locking onto Lily, the only thing that mattered. In the final standoff, Sergei, the image of cold, murderous desperation, held Lily in a chokehold as a shield, raising his gun to shoot Dominic. Dominic froze, his attention split between the threat and his need to protect the girl. I knew the rule of this world: the person who acts first survives, and that Dominic could not shoot without risking Lily's life. In that split second of hesitation, I lunged not for Lily but for the gun of the collapsed guard, the one I had taken down with the sedative. My hands, usually steady for stitching wounds and calming frightened animals, were steady now for the trigger. I shot Sergei, aiming not for the head, but for the shoulder and chest, enough to incapacitate him and force him to drop the girl, the blast echoing deafeningly in the concrete room, bringing the war to an end. I watched the Russian fall, his face twisted in disbelief. The final war ended by my own hands. my own curse finally broken. I dropped the smoking gun and rushed to Lily, pulling her into a tight, desperate hug, checking her for harm, whispering reassurances. When I turned back, Dominic was staggering, the blood loss and the adrenaline crash finally hitting him all at once. He collapsed forward and I caught him, all his power and weight suddenly resting on my small frame. My hands, now stained with his blood, gripped his torn suit, and I leaned down, the memory of my old angry words dissolving into a desperate plea. I whispered into his ear, no longer the threat, but the promise, closing the loop on the entire insane journey. Touch me again, no. Hold me, we survived because of you. I was underestimated, I was judged, I was placed in a gilded cage and told I was a pet, a mistake, a liability because of where I came from and what I lacked. But the quiet strength I carried, the dignity I never let them take, was the only thing that saw me through. They thought my worth was tied to my bank account or my address, but it was tied to the moral code I refused to break, the sheer willpower to survive and protect the innocent. I was never a victim. I was simply waiting for the right moment, the right leverage, the right person to show them exactly what I was capable of. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever felt like your truth was too small for the world to notice, I want you to know that your quiet strength is your greatest armor. You were never small and you were never unseen. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.